This is the chapter on the 1920s, lesson 7, surviving the Great Depression. You can see it's a bad day when the Chamber of Commerce is posting billboards telling people, we don't need you, we can't take care of our own, so you showing up in town isn't making things better for us or you. Well, Americans have always had a fighting spirit, and even at times will go beyond political affiliation, religious affiliation, ethnic affiliation, and just become Americans. And they'll pull together and get through even the toughest times. Throughout the country, many people started to pull together to help one another out. This is during the 1930s, where the stock market crash has spread. It's affecting all people, not just the people who invested in the stock market. One group in particular that really worked together to help each other out were the farmers. They would stick together and protect each other's land. And as we talked about in previous lessons, farmers who couldn't pay their mortgages, they couldn't pay for the equipment that they've bought. The banks would come in and foreclose on the property. They would take over the property, but a bank doesn't want the property. So now the bank is going to do what it can to try to sell it and get as much money as they can. They'd put it up for auction. So the other farmers in the community would show up, and they would turn the auction into what they called a penny auction, where they would keep the bidding very low, actually at times physically keeping potential investors, people who were trying to come in and actually buy the land, keeping them away from the auction. So they would keep the bidding very low and then return the land to the former owner. So they would win the bidding at a very low price and then just give it to the former landowner. You can see this was the first penny auction here, where farmers were crowding around the auctioneer and intimidating the real bidders and trying to keep them away from the process. Most Americans trusted that our democratic process was going to handle the situation, that our government was going to figure out a way to fix this. However, one of the negatives that came out of all this is that the Communist Party gained a lot of new members. As a matter of fact, this was the one time in our history where more people were leaving this country than coming in. And communism is one of those things we've talked about, a number of times up to this point. But communism is something that feeds on you struggling, because what they're offering you is everybody has food, everybody has a house, everybody has a job. It's not going to be a lot of food, and it's not going to be a nice house, and it's not going to be the best job, and everybody's going to get paid the same. But it's better than having nothing. And this equal distribution of wealth where everybody had the same amount of money, basically, same kind of housing, same kind of job. There's no homeless, there's no hungry. Like, everybody has. That's the ideal. And that's not necessarily the way it's going to work out, but that's what they're promoting. And the American people are right now in the middle of this Great Depression. Communism seemed interesting. So there were some signs of change. Well, first of all, prohibition is repealed. You can see, if you remember, prohibition was the making it our government made it illegal for people to produce, sell, or consume alcohol. Well, that's gone. In February of 1933, 15 years after the 18th Amendment was passed, that was prohibition, Congress passed the 21st Amendment, repealing prohibition. Basically, the 21st gets rid of the 18th. And you can see everyone seemed to be pretty happy about this, including bartenders who maybe didn't have a job before, and men and women in the bar toasting the situation. Control of alcohol returned to the states instead of the gangsters. So, and during Prohibition, remember that it was the mafia that was growing in strength, and one of the unforeseen results of Prohibition was gangsters and mafiosa and all that craziness had kind of taken over the alcohol industry. Well, now it's back to the states. One other sign of change that was happening in the 1930s was something called the Empire State Building. Now, many of you have probably been to New York City, and you may have even seen or toured or been up to the top of the Empire State Building. Well, this was something that was announced in 1930 as something that we were going to build. Americans were going to build this crazy, incredible skyscraper, and it became the symbol of hope. It was going to employ a lot of people, and if we can get this thing built, we can do anything. That was the kind of mentality that they were selling. Our government was selling us in this situation. Between 2,500 and 4,000 people were working on the Empire State Building on any given day. That's a lot of people getting a paycheck and able to buy their own food and support their families, whereas they were struggling before this. This was something bigger than anything we had seen before. It was 102 stories tall. It was 1,250 feet up into the sky, and it opened just over a year after they started building it in May of 1931. So, in case you've never been to the Empire State Building, this is what it used to look like. I mean, this is what it looked like in its infant stages, as you can see them building it. We're starting from the ground and working their way up. And then finally, at the final stage, it was a lot cleaner and whiter than it is today, but that is the Empire State Building. This is one of the most famous pictures of the building of the Empire State Building. A lot of the guys who were working on it, you can see them sitting on a beam way above the city and having lunch and cigarettes. They don't seem bothered by the whole scenario. I'd be losing my mind. And of course, if you build the Empire State Building and it's the highest and the tallest building in New York City, well, you know what's going to happen. Giant King Kong like gorillas are going to climb to the top. It's inevitable. Hoover's limited strategy. President Hoover was sure that the key to recovery was getting the American people to be confident in the economy. He hoped businesses would voluntarily keep wages up. And see, this is where you start to learn the difference between the way that Republicans look at government and the way that Democrats look at government. You're at the age where you're looking at potentially voting in a couple of years. And so the idea of identifying with a political party, whether you're going to be a Republican or a Democrat or an independent, following a smaller party, one of the things that is one of the major factors determining if you're more Republican or more Democrat is how involved you think government should get in your daily life or in the daily lives of businesses. Republicans tend to think that government should stick its nose out of your business, and Democrats want to see the government get more involved and provide social programs and government-sponsored programs for to help the economy and to help people out. Both sides are have had success stories. That's just the difference. So Republicans took a beating in the 1930 midterm elections. So again, I think we've talked about this, where 1928 was the presidential election year, and then 1932 will be the next presidential election. But in 1930 is what we call the midterm. It's right in between, and this is where the Congress is up for grabs, meaning all of the House of Representatives runs every 2 years. So in 1930, all of the House is up for re-election. Also, 1/3 of the Senate is probably up for re-election as well. Okay, so basically, the midterm election is kind of a report card on the president. How are you doing? If you're doing really well, then the American people tend to vote for congressional representatives and senators who reflect the ideals of the president of the United States and his party. If you're not doing a good job, and the American people feel that that's the case, then they tend to vote for the other party and for people who think the opposite of how the president thinks. That's what happens here. The Republicans end up taking a beating in the 1930 midterm election because the American people didn't feel like the Republicans and Herbert Hoover were doing a good job. Hoover tried some federal programs, but in the end, he felt that it was up to the states, private charities, and local officials to handle relief. Again, that's the standard Republican line, is that the government should stick its nose out and that private industry, private people, private charities should be the ones who keep things moving forward. Well, the public didn't appreciate this, and his unpopularity is growing. New Deal for America. Republicans again named Hoover as their candidate for the election of 1932. And the Democrats selected a guy who at the time was the governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, otherwise known as, well, there he is. There's Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He's got those Woodrow Wilson glasses, right? That like sit on your nose and there's no like arm that reaches back around your ear. I don't know what you do with those things. If somebody what if you sneeze? What happens? They have to go flying. What if somebody calls your name from behind you and you whip around? Like, do your glasses go? I don't know. I don't get them. I don't get it. Anyway, the Democrats selected FDR, and FDR was a very hot upcoming candidate in the Democratic Party. He was a graduate of Harvard, Ivy League school, one of the most reputable educational establishments in the United States. He worked as a lawyer, served in the New York State Senate, became assistant secretary to the Navy. Then in 1921, he came down with polio. Now, polio is something that we don't see, I don't think we see at all today. I mean, there's still a polio vaccine out there, but he ends up coming down with polio back in the 1920s. The vaccine isn't available till the 1950s. But he's really never able to walk again without assistance, without crutches or being wheeled around in a wheelchair. He's elected. Now, despite this, he gets elected governor of New York until 1932. And this is where the election is coming up. The Democrats have targeted him as their candidate, and he has certainly produced. He brings this youthful energy and this spirit of optimism, and he promises a new deal for America. Even though he doesn't have a real idea or plan, this idea of a new deal for America is attractive to people, and it's going to become very popular. Now, one of the slightly weird things, I guess you can say, is he married a cousin of his. It's a distant cousin. It's not illegal. It's a little odd, but he did marry his cousin, a distant cousin, Eleanor, who was the niece of Teddy Roosevelt, former president of the United States. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt ends up being a very good first lady. Spoiler alert, FDR is going to win the election. And she works for several causes, and really makes them kind of a power couple in Washington, D.C. eventually. New York first, and then Washington, D.C. So as I gave away already, just to show you, the election of 1932 is between Hoover's reelection and this new young energy of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So it comes down to those who believe that the federal government could not and should not try to fix people's problems. That's the Republican side. And the other side says that large-scale problems such as the Depression required the government's help. So those are the two polar opposites. That's the Democratic side versus the Republican side, who thinks the government should not try to fix people's problems. Well, apparently, at the time, the American people agreed with FDR, and he wins the presidency by a huge margin of 7 million popular votes. I'm saying I had these notes written a long time before we had a situation where, Joe Biden, Scranton native Joe Biden, has just beaten Donald Trump, and in the election of 2020, and his margin of victory was, almost 7 or 8 million votes. 80 to, about 7 million votes. So you can see the map of the election of 1932 based on the Electoral College distribution. And you can see that the Republican vote basically was well an area that is traditionally very liberal Democrat, Pennsylvania, and then New England outside of Massachusetts. FDR wins New York, his home state, and everything else. it's a it's a it's a pretty good beatdown by FDR over Herbert Hoover. And our 32nd president of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So right now he's got to get the American people back on their feet, and he's got to restore their hope. That's huge, right? I mean, we've talked about how big a factor humiliation is. When people are humiliated, they tend to do things that are very above and beyond what they would normally do in a negative way. But when people have confidence, when people feel hopeful, when people feel like that they have a chance to be successful, good things start to happen too. He thought that building public confidence in the future was essential to calming panic and creating support for Franklin Delano Roosevelt's plans, for his own plans. He spoke to the nation regularly on the radio. He had what he called fireside chats, where the American people can picture him sitting in front of a fireplace with his, smoking jacket on and just sitting comfortably in the chair and talking to them in a confident manner. Now, the reality was he was sitting at a desk reading from a script and had a bunch of microphones in front of him so that the radio broadcasts could happen. And he was the first American president to talk to the American people weekly, just to give them an update as to how things are going. And the American people ate it up. And he really had no plan. Like, this whole New Deal thing was something that he sold to the American people, but there was really nothing behind it. It just was his sense of optimism and energy and willingness to experiment that won the support of the American people. So now he's got to come up with something that, this New Deal program. So this comes to refer to the relief, recovery, and reform programs of his administration. So oftentimes the president, the first kind of benchmark of the presidency is those first 100 days. What did you do in your first 100 days as president? And if you look over the history of presidents, early in their administration is when they tend to get a lot of things done. In his first 100 days, FDR pushed program after program after program through Congress to provide relief, create jobs, and stimulate the economic activity. Now, he does have a very cooperative Congress who are passing these bills for him. He restored public confidence in the nation's banks. He assured the people that their banks would not fail again. As a matter of fact, your money will be insured up to a certain point. Corrected problems that led to the stock market crash, problems that we've certainly talked about already. He took America off what is called the gold standard, and he devalued the American dollar. That would help raise the price of farm products and other goods. That would help our farmers out and our factories. He sent federal funding to help overburdened local relief agencies. He took the burden onto the federal government as opposed to local agencies who couldn't afford to help. He created the public works programs. These were government-funded projects to build public facilities. This was improving roads and parks and airports. There's so many projects in Northeast Pennsylvania that are public works programs. You might see a cornerstone in certain buildings or on certain roads or in certain bridges that say WPA, the Public Works Program. And now you can see it there, the Works Program. And this is where they built public parks and things around the city. They rebuilt streets, bridges. They helped rebuild our infrastructure. And this created jobs. And it didn't pay a lot, but it gave people jobs. And people who had jobs got a paycheck at the end of every week or 2 weeks or whatever, and they felt like they earned that. And then they felt pride in the ability to be able to take care of their family again. And this was big, and it was huge in restoring the confidence of the American people. One of the biggest programs of the WPA, the Works Program, was the Hoover Dam. So we'll come back to the Hoover Dam, but that was damming the Colorado River out in Nevada. The Civilian Conservation Corps was FDR's favorite within his public works program because it had to do with nature, maintaining forests and beaches and parks. You can see the Camp Number One, Camp Roosevelt, that the Civilian Conservation Corps had put together there. So this was one that had to do with nature, and that was a big Roosevelt family thing. If you remember, Teddy Roosevelt was huge in the wilderness and nature. Another aspect of the New Deal was refinancing mortgages for homeowners to make their payments more manageable. Um, if you could refinance your mortgage, it basically means that you're agreeing to pay a lower interest rate, but a longer period of time. So if you owe money, you have a longer period of time to pay back that money, so you can pay less per month. So it gives you more money to put into food and to things for your family and your kids. FDR was also very progressive. He was looking forward. He had some groundbreaking appointments. He surrounded himself with very eager, hardworking advisors, and he didn't care what gender they were or what color they were. He was the first president to appoint a woman, Frances Perkins, to his cabinet, Secretary of Labor. If you ever, this is not one of my favorite movies or plays or whatever, but Annie. Annie's a pretty famous movie and play. But the president character in Annie is based on FDR, and his secretary is based off of Frances Perkins. He broke new ground by hiring African Americans to more than 100 policymaking posts. No president had ever done this before, and the Democratic Party is proving to be the friend of the minorities in this situation. Eleanor Roosevelt, FDR's wife, as we've talked about, like I said, she kind of makes them a power couple in Washington, D.C., also played a major role in supporting the New Deal and traveled widely for FDR. Remember, he's handicapped. He's in a wheelchair a lot of times. He's got braces and crutches. And to be honest, they hid all this from the American people. You see him in this picture, he looks fine. But that's the magic of the picture, right? Pictures speak 1,000 words. But the reality was that he's going to end up having to be helped off that couch and put into a wheelchair and wheeled around, or given his crutches, and he can kind of get around on his own a little slowly. But the American people would have had a hard time voting for someone who was handicapped. So the people around him made sure that he always appeared strong and energetic, whereas the reality was he was not healthy. So the whole New Deal thing worked out pretty good, but the midterm election of 1934 proved this. So he wins in 32. 1934 is the midterms, and it's kind of, again, that's kind of the report card. How are we doing as president? Well, the American people loved what he was doing, and he ends up winning a lot of Congress, which means it's going to be helpful in him getting his legislation passed. He launches, because now he has more support in Congress, he launches a new, even bolder burst of legislation, which was his response to critics who said that he hadn't done enough for ordinary people. That he was, in the first wave, he was basically helping like businesses. Now the second wave was going to focus on individuals. He wins the 1936 presidential election in a major landslide. And you can see the map there. He won by even more than he did the first time. His popular vote, well, you can see a total vote of 45 million, and he ended up with over 11 million more than his opponent, which was Alf Landon. Just to give you something to compare that to, Joe Biden himself had like 81 million votes in our election of 2020. So, the total number of people who voted back in 1936 was 45 million. Our last election, our president-elect, Joe Biden, had over 80 million, 81 million, I believe, and Donald Trump had 74 million. So you can see how many people are now active in our process as compared to back then.